Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. This one's going to be about Hong Kong's new national security law, the UK's response to it, and the circumstances which led up to this moment. If you're not already, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are new here, let me recommend a few videos I think you might like on the topics of China, conflicts and borders. All of these videos are linked in the description, so while you're down there subscribing, please be sure to click the links to these videos too. Thanks for your support. So, on the 1st of July 2020, the Chinese legislature, the National People's Congress, imposed a national security law on Hong Kong in response to the pro-democracy protests that have been ongoing for the past year. The protests were triggered back in June 2019 by the introduction of a bill called the Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Legislation Bill 2019, which would have essentially allowed China to extradite political opponents in Hong Kong and try them in China. While this bill was the tipping point, the protests are the culmination of years of political tension between China and Hong Kong, which is why, when the bill was finally withdrawn in September 2019, the protests continued. The protests have 5 explicit demands. For the protests not to be characterised as a riot, for amnesty for arrested prisoners, an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality, implementation of complete universal suffrage, and a withdrawal of the bill, which has been achieved. The 4th demand, the implementation of universal suffrage, has an interesting history. The British took Hong Kong in the late 19th century over the Opium Wars, which were basically when Britain attacked China for trying to criminalise the lucrative opium trade. Before we get a load of comments, yes, it's more complicated than that, but it would probably require another 10-minute video, so that's all you're getting. Having won the war, the British forced the Chinese into signing a 99-year lease beginning on the 1st of July 1898 in what the Chinese now call an unequal treaty. When Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, Hong Kong was supposed to exist under the one country, two systems framework. Basically, while Hong Kong would be a part of China, it would keep its own pre-existing capitalist system for the next 50 years, until 2047. That means its own currency, its own legal system, a free pass, the rights to protest, and its own legislature. These rights were supposed to be guaranteed to Hong Kong via a sort of mini-constitution called the Basic Laws of Hong Kong, which were agreed between China and Britain in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. For the purposes of this video, we're interested in Article 23, which deals with the national security laws, and Article 45, which reads, "The ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures." This article explains the Hong Kong protests' demand for universal suffrage. The Basic Law promises properly democratic universal suffrage, but 23 years later, nearly halfway through the 50 years, this still hasn't happened. When China received Hong Kong in 1997, Hong Kong's legislative body, the Legislative Council, otherwise known as LegCo, had 60 members, 30 of which were elected by geographical constituency, 30 of which were elected by so-called functional constituencies. Geographic constituencies are what you'd expect. Much like in the UK, each member of LegCo represents a geographical area, and if you live in that area, that's where you vote. With functional constituencies, the electorate isn't restricted by geography, but rather by sector. So for example, the agriculture and fisheries industry has a seat in the LegCo, elected only by specific people in the agriculture and fisheries industry. For obvious reasons, these functional constituencies are not particularly democratic. They have very restrictive franchises and they undermine the basic democratic principle of one man, one vote. When China took over, they saw this as essentially too democratic. For the 1998 elections, they cut the number of geographical constituencies down to 20, restricted the franchises of the functional constituencies from about 1.1 million eligible voters in 1995 to 140,000 in 1998, which meant the functional constituencies were essentially chosen by Hong Kong elites who are far more likely to be pro-Beijing, and implemented a form of proportional representation instead of the first first-past-the-post method used previously to give pro-Beijing candidates better chance. So, instead of having 20 separate single-member constituencies, Hong Kong was split into 5 multi-member constituencies, where voters chose their top 3 to 5 candidates. The remaining 10 seats in LegCo were given to the Election Committee, an 800-member committee of mainly pro-Beijing elites, who were also responsible for choosing the chief executive of Hong Kong. This is obviously not the universal suffrage described in Article 45. Since then, there have been small improvements. The number of geographical constituencies went up to 24 in 2000 and back up to 30 in 2004, replacing the 10 election committee seats. Reforms in 2010 increased the number of geographical constituencies to 35 and added 5 more functional constituencies known as superseats, which anyone not eligible for a functional constituency can vote in. This means that everyone in Hong Kong essentially gets 2 votes, one for your geographical constituency and one for your functional constituency. If you're not eligible to vote in a traditional functional constituency, like agriculture fisheries, you vote for your favourite superseat candidate. The reforms also increased the membership of the election committee from 800 to 1,200. As we mentioned before, this election committee chooses the chief executive of Hong Kong, which is sort of the equivalent of the president in the US. The election committee is mostly elected in a similar way to functional constituencies. Different sectors elect candidates who represent their interests in the committee. For example, agriculture and fisheries have 60 seats in the election committee, and all 60 members ran uncontested in the last election committee election in 2016. There are 117 seats for democratically elected district councillors in the committee, but these make up less than 10% of the total. Again, definitely not the universal suffrage promised to Hong Kong in Article 45. Anyway, despite this democratic deficit, Hong Kong seemed to be doing fine until Xi Jinping came into power in 2013. Xi Jinping seems to take a more interventionist attitude than previous administrators, and tensions have been rising since. In 2014, China required that any chief executive candidate must love the country China and love Hong Kong, effectively implying that China would be screening possible candidates. This triggered the umbrella protests, where pro-democracy protesters camped out at central business districts for nearly 3 months. In 2015, 5 staff members of Causeway Bay Books were detained in mainland China, at least one of whom was taken from Hong Kong and allegedly forced into giving scripted confessions on Chinese state TV. Between November 2016 and July 2017, China disqualified 6 elected pro-democracy members of LegCo for using the oath-taking ceremony as a platform for protest. China controversially interpreted the Basic Law such that a person who intentionally reads out words which do not accord with the wording of the oath prescribed by law or takes the oath in a manner which is not sincere or not solemn would be barred from public office, and didn't let them retake the oath. This exposes a fundamental flaw in the Basic Law. It is subject to interpretation by mainland China, who can sort of interpret it in any way they like. In September 2018, China claimed that mainland Chinese law would apply in some parts of Hong Kong's West Kowloon terminus, which links Hong Kong to China's high-speed rail network, an apparent violation of Basic Law Article 18, which prevents Chinese law from applying in Hong Kong. And, in October 2018, China unveiled the Hong Kong-Zhuhai Bridge, which was to be paid for by Hong Kong taxpayers and was seen by some from Hong Kong as a Chinese attempt to accelerate Hong Kong-China integration. Finally, the extradition bill in 2019 was a step too far, and Hong Kong tipped into full-on protest. As many as 2 million people took part in the protest, and its popularity was reflected in the district council elections in November 2019, where pro-democracy candidates won over 80% of the seats, leaving 17 of the 18 councils under pro-democratic majorities. But, while the extradition bill was withdrawn, China looks unlikely to agree to any of the protesters' other demands, and has now decided to impose national security law on Hong Kong to try and end the protests once and for all. National security laws are talked about in Article 23 of the Basic Law, which says that Hong Kong should enact national security laws to prohibit treason, secession, sedition, and subversion against Chinese government. But this law wasn't actually introduced by Hong Kong. It was imposed on Hong Kong by the National People's Congress of China. Article 18 says that mainland China can't impose legislation on Hong Kong except when it comes to defence, foreign affairs, or exceptional circumstances in which China declares either a state of war or state of emergency, as described in Annex 3 of Basic Law. None of these conditions were satisfied, but China can add conditions to Annex 3 as they please, so that's what they did to bypass LegCo. The text of the law was only published when it came into force at 11 PM local time on June the 30th, and that's pretty scary stuff. It includes 66 articles and is over 7,000 words long. Damaging government buildings counts as subversion and carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Damaging public transport counts as terrorism, and suspects can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. It includes plans for a new Chinese security office in Hong Kong, gives China the power to interpret the law as they wish, with any interpretation taking precedence over local Hong Kong law, gives the chief executive power to appoint judges, allows for some trials to take place behind closed doors, and even allows for cases to be tried in mainland China. The interpretation thing is especially scary because some bits of the law are ridiculously ambiguous. For example, Article 29 states that anyone who conspires with foreigners to provoke hatred of the Chinese government or the authorities in Hong Kong could have committed a criminal offence. Even Hong Kong's Justice Secretary Teresa Cheng couldn't explain the provision in a press conference on Wednesday. The law also contradicts some of the provisions in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. The fact that mainland Chinese authorities can take jurisdiction over certain cases violates paragraphs 3 and 5 of the Declaration, which deal with the judicial independence. And the presence of a new Chinese agency violates paragraphs 3, which says that maintenance of public order should be the responsibility of LegCo. This is why Boris Johnson described this security law as a clear and serious violation of the Joint Declaration, and, in reaction, offered the 2.9 million Hong Kong citizens with British national overseas status, most of whom will have lived in Hong Kong before 1997, and any of their dependents a bespoke 5-year visa into the UK. This is a remarkably popular move for the government, at least according to a populace poll commissioned by the China Research Group, which found that 61% of the public were in favour to it and only 11% against it. Interestingly, the same poll found that, in general, the British public want the UK to take a harder line on China. In response, China told the UK to stop interfering, accusing it of a colonial state of mind, with a Chinese ambassador to the UK, Chen Wen, threatening consequences if the UK went ahead with its citizenship plan. So what do you think of all this? Is the national security law a terrifying piece of totalitarian tyranny, or are we just having opinions on things we shouldn't? Should the government have offered visas to 3 million Hong Kong citizens, or would that number perhaps be better spent over a larger number of countries working together to accommodate them? Anyway, please drop us a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and do tell us if we got anything wrong. None of us are experts on China, so it's very possible we did. If you do want to fact check us on this video, then please go to our website, click on this specific video on the website and fill in the form below the video. That will allow you to fact check us and we'll try to respond to any of the complaints you may have. Thank you for watching.